Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Daniela Yu. I hope you enjoyed your break and I hope you also enjoyed the 2 plenary sessions this morning with David Marsh and Phil Ball. Right, we are going to invite you to join us to our next guest speaker, Fernanda Liberali, Dr. Fernanda Liberali. Hello Fernanda, good morning.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you again. I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to be together yesterday and today again. So thank you very much, Cultura Inglesa, all the organizers, for the possibility of being with you today. It's really a pleasure, and it was a pleasure to be with Ofelia as well. I hope we can have a great time together in this morning.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you. But before handing it over to you and Ofelia Garcia, I would like to introduce you both to the audience. Okay? Okay, first of all, Fernanda Liberali and Ofelia will be discussing translanguaging as a tool for confronting inequalities. Fernanda Liberali, actually, Dr. Fernanda Coelho Liberali is a teacher, educator, researcher, and professor at PUC São Paulo. She holds a master's and a doctorate degree in Lael PUC from PUC São Paulo and 3 postdoctoral degrees from University of Helsinki, the Free University of Berlin, and Rutgers University. She's a Brazilian representative of the International Committee of the International Symposium Bilingue Latam, and an associate with Eastside Institute, a member of Global Network of the University of Leeds, the general coordinator of DigitMed program and the Bancada project, and co-founder of the Global Play Brigade. Right, and the second speaker is Professor Dr. Ofelia García. She's a professor emerita in the PhD program in urban education and Latin American, Iberian, and Latino cultures at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Ofelia Garcia has published widely in the areas of bilingualism and bilingual education, the education of language minoritized bilinguals, sociology of language, and language policy. Among her best-known books are Bilingual Education in the 21st Century, A Global Perspective, New Window, and Translanguaging, Language Bilingualism and Education, with Li Wei, which received the 2015 British Association of Applied Linguistics Award. In 2017, Ofelia also received the Charles Ferguson Award in Applied Linguistics and the EIRA Lifetime Career Award in Bilingual Education. She's also a member of the National Academy of Education. Again, you can interact in the chat box, and then later on you can ask and send us some questions. Okay? Fernanda and Ofelia, now it's over to you.
Thank you very much, all the Cultura Inglesa organizers and participants. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and it's even more pleasant because I'm here with my dear friend Ofelia, and I like to talk to her about different issues all the time. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity. So, muito obrigada, everyone, for this possibility. I thank Ofelia for being here and for this possibility of discussing this topic, which for me is so essential. It's about translanguaging, but it's about translanguaging as a tool for confronting inequalities. And this, in the moment that we are going through in Brazil, is very, very essential. So we organize this talk like this. I will talk a little bit, setting the idea, and then Ofelia will have a chance to speak about this topic in more depth, and then we will talk a little bit together, and then we will open for you to ask questions and participate as much as you want. So, to start my conversation with you today, I will just set the idea that we are going through challenges that are horrible for our countries all over the world and mainly here in Brazil. The ethical and the geopolitical challenges we face, they increase the inequalities that our present society has. We deal now with a lot of exploitation, violence, with oppression and injustice in different contexts. And the COVID, this devastating disease, has exposed that these inequalities, they are too great and they stress the gap between those who have and those who don't. And this is something we have to deal with today. In order to talk about this, we can reflect about the concept of necropolitics that Mbembe has presented, that says that some people or some governments, they have the power to decide who will live and who will die and how they will do it. But I have thought a lot about this in terms of education, and we have discussed the concept of macroeducation. That is an education that decides those who will have a chance to go through educational processes and those who will not. Those who will have access to classes will go to schools or will have internet connections that will allow them to go through remote education, and those who are not. So we leave these inequalities in depth this year and last year. And this calls for something that we've been calling a decolonized way of looking at our reality. Learning with the other, with the difference, and learning from those who are normally ignored, they are silenced. How can we make these multiple voices available, heard, valued, empowered in our community? I believe that when we talk about translanguaging, we create a possibility for these voices to come up. And I think that Ofelia has presented in many of her work this idea that education and having a more open-minded perspective of language can allow people to transcend their oppression and find ways to move beyond their immediate reality. What I'm going to show now is an example of how we have worked with this in a project we organized here in Brazil at one of our universities about putting people together, teachers, students, researchers, principals, to think about education, to think about their different ways of teaching. And in this example that I brought, we have participants from a public school for Haitian students, and they talk a little bit about their situation. In this very small example, what we can see is how language becomes the vehicle for people to start very important discussions. You will see snippets of the conversations that they have, but I think it's going to be very important for later on Ofelia to build on the concept of translanguage and how this can be a decolonizing perspective for us to think about our realities. So this is the example. You will see students talking. They have different moments. We work with performance, and in this case, these students are participating of what we call the theater of the oppressed, based on Augusto Boal. So the girls will be performing, then they will be talking about it, and then other people will be expressing how they viewed the whole thing. So it's in Portuguese and in Creole, but I hope you can understand a little bit.
Picolé. Vamos com 2, 3, ação! Eu falar de Haiti, falar de Haiti, nós chamamos no Brasil, morar tipo, conhecer uma pessoa. A gente se conheceu, a gente falou onde a gente se conheceu na escola, onde qual país que a gente é, a gente falou o nome, a gente falou qual os nossos sonhos, qual a coisa que a gente mais gosta.
O que vocês estão no Brasil?
Para procurar ajuda.
O que aconteceu?
É que a gente passa muito fome.
A experiência de poder desenvolver empatia, que é difícil você sair da sua vida e tentar se conectar com a vida de alguém. Então, ouvir isso e passar de tipo só a matéria corrida, que a gente sabe que as pessoas imigram para procurar situação de vida melhor, mas ver isso, presenciar isso é uma outra coisa que eu achei muito legal e eu queria compartilhar.
So in this short video you saw, you could see the girls working with the different languages and the Brazilians trying to connect with them while they were speaking Creole, then their explanations about the language, and finally how the people reacted towards what they saw. In these videos, the idea that we have is that translanguage is in a de-encapsulated pedagogical practice, because participants used all their background, not only language gestures, but also all their lives in order to interact with what was being said. And by doing so, they could express what they felt, how they felt, and they could go beyond them. What do you think, Ofelia? Could you speak a little bit to us about all this?
Ay, obrigada, como siempre, Fernanda. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak to you in what is probably a warm Brazil, where we are in New York City under a lot of snow. There's a big snowstorm out there. So it's good to have the occasion to just think differently about what's going on outside and in our worlds and in our lives, and through the pandemic and the difficult times that we're all having. So I thought what I would do today to sort of frame this conversation with bilingual teachers around translanguaging is start with sort of a story, then think about what is translanguaging, and then think about what bilingual teachers should do in a classroom. So let me take those three topics. So I start with a story because I think sometimes, like you always do performances, I think that it's stories that we remember. So this is the story of Ana. Ana's a Brazilian girl in a bilingual school. She's a fourth grader, so she's about 9, 10. And Ana has a jewelry box. And in her jewelry box, she has pearls of two kinds. She has white pearls and she has black pearls. But there is some legislation in Brazil that says that you have to only wear the black pearls on one day, and then the next day you can only use the white pearls, which Ana does. But Ana knows that this is just legislation, that this is not what she can use, that her repertoire, what she has, is a lot greater than these two colors. And I tell that story because it's very difficult for all of us who think about bilingualism to think of what translanguaging brings to bilingualism. So yes, you may want to think of white pearls as being Portuguese and black pearls as being English. And there are times in which you will have to only wear your black pearls because you're in a context where that is what is called for. But most of the time, we have all these jewels inside of us, and we can use them. And what I try to always make bilingual teachers understand is that we are not using all the resources that children have, all the jewels that they have, right? All their ability to imagine, to extend, to do with language. So the question then is, what is translanguaging, right? And we have been taught to think about bilingualism as simply being an addition of two languages, right? You start out with Portuguese in Brazil and you add English and you become bilingual. But the problem is that bilinguals, as they acquire these pearls, they use all of their resources. They don't just use the pearls that you want them to use, right? So translanguaging is really about learning to see and hear bilinguals, not from the external language perspective, not as different colors, but really from the internal part of the student. What is it that students do with their language? So this difference between having and doing is very important, because languages, bilingualism is never had. Bilingualism is used, and we do with language whatever it is that we need. So, I think it's important for teachers to understand that at times in schools, the product that we want may be in one language or the other. But the idea is that in the process, like you said, Fernanda, in the process, we don't have to be limited to these differences, right? That we can really use all our repertoire, all our web of meanings, to really generate ideas, and that this is very, very important. Because after all, what we have is just a string of pearls that are of many, many colors, and that we use all the time, right? That we engage with this translanguaging. And this is where I think this translanguaging work connects to what you were saying about a decolonizing perspective, a perspective that looks at silenced knowledges, at what bilinguals have that many monolinguals do not understand, because we are not simply two monolinguals in one. And the idea, of course, that we don't have to behave like monolinguals. We will never behave like monolinguals, but we have to be shown how to use our jewels, right? We have to be shown how to be comfortable with this repertoire. And again, this is where this concept of racial linguistic ideologies also comes in. The idea that sometimes when we look at bilingual children, depending on how we view their race, their gender, their social class, we view them as deficient, even when there is nothing wrong with their language, but we assume them, we hear them as deficient. And this is all caught up in this racial linguistic ideologies, part of translanguaging. So just to then go to the third and final part, what should bilingual teachers then do? So many of the teachers that are listening are people who are in classrooms, in programs that are of certain kinds, and most likely they will be told, you do English at this time, you do Portuguese at this time, you keep both languages separate. So what is it that they have to think about as they teach? And I think the first lesson for all bilingual teachers is to remember that bilingual education has to be for children. It cannot be for languages, right? So I think that shift makes you understand that when you teach bilingually, you have to make sure that what you're doing to develop language fits the child, right? And so that means that you have to have some flexibility, because all children are different, and all children come in with different language and different experiences. So I always say, it's like what you're doing is you're adding pearls to the string, right? You're not adding a box. You're not adding English, right? If you're teaching English in Brazil, you're not adding English. You are adding pearls. You're adding new features that then the child can really use, depending with their own agency, not the legislative agency. And this is related to what you said, Fernanda, about there not being any monolingual texts, because when a child enters a monolingual text, whether it's in English or in Portuguese, you enter with all your experiences, with all your history, with all your language, with all your culture, with all your emotions. You engage with the text. That's what we do. That's what reading is. That's what writing is, also developing that voice. And therefore, it's important to remember that biliteracy that we all worry about is really not about having two different texts, but it's about having one bilingual reader who can really handle these two texts, but that in handling these texts that are supposed to be two monolingual texts, they are really making them whole. They're really bringing them together and making them, their own. So this also reminds me that oral language interaction is most important to develop biliteracy, especially when you teach bilingually. You have to make sure that there's a lot of oral interaction and that you don't stop that oral interaction. And that oral interaction has to be with whatever resources the child has. That means if you are working with a second grader who is not, who has not really added too many pearls that are supposed to be English to his repertoire, you allow him or her to use whatever resources they have, because like you say, language goes beyond the linguistic. Language is also our gestures, the way we move our hands, our eyes, our interactions. All of that is language, and it's part of making meaning, which is what's important. So what I would say is that teachers, bilingual teachers always give me a hard time about translanguaging, because they want to think about, oh, but I do this in English and I do that in Spanish or Portuguese or whatever. But what I always remind them is the spaces are important, because you have to have some curriculum, but you're not responding to the curriculum, you're responding to the child. And therefore, you have to be able to open up translanguaging spaces. I always say translanguaging are not strategies. They're spaces that you open up because you have a stance that recognizes this unitary repertoire of the children. And so if you have this stance, you open up these translanguaging spaces. When do you open them up? Not always. You open them up, for example, for any type of scaffolding that has to happen, because, we think of children as being all the same, but children are not the same. And they're always along all points of a bilingual continuum. So whenever you have them in this language, there's going to be so-and-so that's here and so-and-so that's there. And you have to be able to scaffold, to support them in some way by giving them material in the other language, by helping them through Google Translate, whatever it is that is needed in order for them to really understand what's going on. And I always think of this as, I call them translanguaging rings. They're like, they're related to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, the idea that you can expand the child's learning by giving them the scaffold. The other reason for opening up translanguaging spaces is when you want to really know what the child knows. If you have a 9-year-old who is not yet a person, linguistically speaking, and you're only limiting them to less than half of their repertoire, you can't get to know that child. You cannot know that child holistically. So for documentation, for observation, you have to allow that to happen. How does that happen? It depends. I often see teachers who are doing read alouds in one language. Let's say they're doing it in English, but when the children talk among themselves or when they ask questions, they're allowed to do that in with whatever resources they have. And this has to do with the fact that that you have to be able to make meaning. To learn, you have to make meaning. And how do you make meaning, I think, is important. And how do you get to know the child? Because a child is a lot more than just having specific language features, right? I'm always curious about how is a child using language in general? Can he make relationships with others through language? Can she find key ideas? Does she find it interesting? Is she engaged with the reading? That has nothing to do with the language features you have. And so it's very important to also open up this translanguaging space when you want to really understand what the child can do with language, which is much more than what they can do in English or in Portuguese. And then I think the third space is, I think, more related to what Fernanda, you just showed us right now, is what I call the transformation space, because all bilingual children have to be transformed in the sense of understanding the power of language, the hierarchies that languages represent, the powers that they have, and understand also the oppression that they have experienced through language. And there are histories of colonization, of racialization that are related to language that students have to understand. So this space of this translanguaging space of transformation is a space in which we center their understandings of themselves as very able people with lots of jewels that have not been allowed to shine yet. So how do you make sure that you shine a light on all of that they are? So I think what's most important for teachers is not to think about translanguaging as a strategy, but to think of it as a stance, a belief that you have to, we call it the corriente, right? Because it is a current that's always in the classroom and it's always shifting, and you have to be able to shift with the children as you design, of course, these spaces where you can translanguaging. And I think the last thing I want to say is that the reason why translanguaging is connected, linked to social justice causes, etc., is because it is centered on the students' strengths, not on what anybody else wants from the students, but on their strengths. How do you find their strengths? You can only find their strength if you listen to their voices, and in that way, developing their agency. So that's how it all connects. Fernanda.
I agree. I think that in the example, what you said is very present, because these kids that were there in that moment, they could only connect to those girls who were part of a different reality because they had their possibility to express themselves in their own language.
Absolutely.
And by doing that, the others had somehow to make sense of what they were doing. They had to realize that they had a different reality, not only a different language, but they come from different perspectives of living. And by connecting with these perspectives, all of them amplified, they expanded their possibilities of understanding the world. I always feel that when we put people together with their different languages, we are not only putting them with the different languages, but we are creating for them this this current that you talk about, in the sense that you experience different margins. You forget where you are, and you understand that there is a different reality, and you engage with the reality, with the difficulties and the doubts of a language that you don't know much, and you experience with that. In this group we have deaf students, so many times we have to experience with sign language. And we all exercise Portuguese with sign language, with gestures, not sign exactly, but we dare. And
taking a risk.
Yes, the idea of taking risk for me is essential in translation. What people are thinking about, oh, I'm using this language and that, and I'm thinking, we are taking risk. We are allowing ourselves to take risk. I still remember the first time I met you, and it was my first experience with translanguaging. But because I remember when you were giving this speech in Oaxaca, and you remember that, and you were speaking in a little bit Portuguese, Spanish, and English all together. And I was shocked with that. But it was like a current. We had all to go with the flow of what you were saying and try to
Right,
make sense of all that.
right, right, right.
Because at that place you were talking to indigenous people who
Yeah,
couldn't understand English. You were talking to English speaking people who couldn't understand Spanish. You were talking to
right.
Brazilians who couldn't understand either. And you were talking to people who could understand both. But your aim there was to make what you were saying something like full of life for everybody. And I think that translanguage allows life to go on and
Yeah.
for us to deal with the difficulties and dare to live and resist and expand
Yeah,
our
yeah,
possibilities.
yeah, yeah. You know, Fernanda, it's so funny because in the pandemic, when, you know, I live in New York City and there's not a lot of space, the only thing I can do is I walk to the river, to the East River. And I have been seeing Chinese women who do Tai Chi in the morning. And I finally thought to myself, I'm not doing any exercise. I am going to ask them. And of course, they don't speak English. And it has been such a wonderful experience because we are best friends. And I tell my husband in this pandemic, my only friends are the Chinese women who don't speak English, but we communicate and we, you know, I'm terrible at Tai Chi, just like I'm terrible in Chinese, but you know, it's bringing us together, and it's brought me such joy and peace to be able to participate with them. So, and you know, that reminds me that when you teach, that's just exactly what you have to do. You have to be a co-learner. You have to learn with your students. If you're not willing to put yourself in that place, risk, and innovate and be curious about their lives and what they're about, then you're going to be so bored of teaching. It takes all the joy out of it. So yeah.
That's the thing. We cannot take the joy from learning. We have to infuse students in the context of learning with a lot of joy, but also a lot of daring, because you have to believe that you have to be in touch with the other, and it's not easy. Even if you speak the very same language, issues are involved. We have to be more careful. We have to take care of the relationship that we create through language, and I think it's very important.
No, I'm so glad you said that, because sometimes we think if we have the same language, we understand each other. And for example, I speak a lot to TESOL teachers in the United States. They all speakers of English who are teaching in English, basically. And I struggle with getting them to understand what translanguaging is, because that's why I say the most important thing is your stance. What is your stance? What is your belief about education? Because you have to make sure that you remember that the center of education is the child, right? Sometimes you teach them math, other times you teach them language, but language cannot dominate education. If language dominates education, what you're doing is you're restricting them, you're oppressing them, you're not helping them think, have ideas, be creative, be imaginative, and that's important too.
That's true. Yeah, I completely agree. And I keep thinking about the kinds of classes that we teach, and people are more interested in what they speak than what they create with the language. That's why I like performance so much. Because people get involved with performing some realities, and by doing so and using different resources through translanguaging and creating meaning with the other through performance, they learn ways, feelings, ways of acting that they can use in reality later on. That's
no, and language is a performance.
Yeah,
you know,
of course.
Especially when you're learning a new language, you have to perform it. You know, you don't own it first. So it's all part of the performance, and it certainly goes beyond the linguistic, like you say, right? And the emotions are important too, the feelings, etc. So I think that role playing in a language classroom is essential, because our bodies also hold our language, and we have to be able to also move our bodies to work with the language. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ofelia, would you like to say something before we close this first part and people ask us more questions and pose some ideas for us?
Well, no, I wish I could have been with you live. I wish I could have been there to understand a little bit more your situation, because every school is also different, just like every child is different and every teacher is different. Every school is different. And the objective that each of you have is also different. So, I like to make sure that people always ask me about models, and I hate the word model, because model implies that there's one way of doing it and there's a one better way of doing it. And to me, there are no models. What one has to do is make sure that you understand who the audience is, who the students are, the community, the parents, and then see what fits their goals, their meanings, because every group makes meaning on their own. And how do you make sure that you meet their meanings? So I would say that. And then, of course, I want to say something about the pandemic, maybe. I don't know what the situation is with you. I don't know whether you're doing in-class schooling, or is it remote? Is it remote mostly or not?
It's crazy.
Hybrid. Yeah.
Each week there is a new resolution about being remote or in class. So we still don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. So we're doing a lot of remote teaching, and it's very, very difficult, I think. And that's why I think it's made us a little bit more humble and made us a little bit more flexible, because we have to go with the flow. But, the one thing that I have found that's so interesting for me is we've always tried to find a way of meeting the school and the home a little bit closer. And yet there is no way you can do remote teaching without the home. Yes. So, the fact that the dog comes in, that the sibling, jumps on top of them, that the mother screams, that the bell rings, all of these things are going on. But I think that the benefit is that teachers have finally seen how important the home and the parents as educators are. Even parents, for example, in the United States, parents who do not speak English, right? I was with a teacher the other day, and she said to me, here I thought that this mother who cannot speak English and is not very literate to begin with, could not help her son. And I see her sitting next to him, and it just blew my mind how she was explaining what he had to do, even though the work was all going on in English, and she was so comfortable with it. So, I think that we are living such hard times that we have to sort of savor these good, very, very good moments that happen, right? Just like I'm looking at the snow now and thinking it's so nice. I'm at my daughter's house, and I live in a small apartment on the second floor. I can't see much out, but I'm so enjoying the snow today. So actually something that I was not expecting, it's good to be enjoying it. So I think that teachers are doing a phenomenal job under very difficult circumstances. I think that the warriors in this war have been the teachers who have kept on teaching in the midst of a real time of need. So I salute them. I think teachers are wonderful, and and I think that we will have better times, I'm sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ofelia. It's always so good, so awesome to listen to you and your ideas, explanations, and also this strength you give us to think about the future and possibilities that are good for our future. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Obrigada.
Obrigada.
Obrigada. Adiós.
Great. Fernanda, thank you, Fernanda and Ofelia, for this. This was super interesting, and our participants got super involved, and there is a lot of discussion going on, lots of questions as well. But before handing over to some questions, Fernanda, would you like to expand on any aspect, anything that you'd like to talk or say before I send you the questions?
Well, just a little bit so that we can listen more to the people, but I think it's important to say the political aspect of translanguaging. I think the whole discussion now that I also saw it from a different perspective is that translanguage is a tool, but a tool for a political stance as well. I think that when we translate, we are not simply using languages or using something that will give basis for L1, L2, for minorities or for whatever. We are using a political tool to create a better world for everyone, and that is very essential.
Right, wonderful. All right, so I have a question here. The first question is from Camila Celarin, and she's asking, isn't it important to value Portuguese even during English lessons to help us cope with the idea of decolonization?
Oh, very nice question. And the idea of decolonization is completely linked to this. I think that it's important to value all forms of expressions that people can use to create meaning together. We have to bear in mind that it's not the fact that I use this or that language that creates possibility for communication, but the fact that people are trying hard to create meaning together so they can use whatever they want. I love examples of people trying to connect to one another, no matter how. If it's a gesture, if it's a movement, if it's a language from a different language that you know, just the fact that you are trying to connect to the other and make sense together, create meaning together. This, I think, is the most important thing. So, but then you may ask, but I'm teaching English because that's the only space the kids have for learning a language. Even so, it's not only learning a language, it's also learning how to communicate with the other, how to interact with the other, and find ways to make people understand that they also have to dare to participate. I always end my mails and my letters with Portuguese words, even when I'm talking to Russians or to Australians or whoever they are, because it's essential that our language interweave with theirs so they can also be learning a little bit about us, our culture, and our ideas.
Wonderful. All right, and we also have another question. This comes from João, and he's asking, immigrant children sometimes face discrimination for using two languages simultaneously. The question here is how to raise awareness that this process is not only benefiting to bilingual children, but also monolinguals.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. We work with Cieja Peru, where they have more than 600 Haitian students, and the ones who participated in the video I presented. But the idea is, how do we make Brazilian students understand that by being together with these people, they are also learning and expanding their possibilities. This, as Ofelia mentioned, is a stance. So we live in a world with diversity. If we learn how to deal with people who have different backgrounds, different languages, different ways of expressing, different choices of how to live their lives, we will expand our own possibilities of living. So Brazilian students learn a lot with immigrant children, but we, as we do with some of the schools, we work with the teachers first, because teachers, they see second language as that language that you have to speak correctly with the appropriate grammar as they learned in school. So when they see an immigrant student, they think, I can't speak that language, even if it's Spanish, which is closer to Portuguese. And because of that, they cannot connect with the student, the immigrant student. So the moment the teacher understands that creating meaning together with whatever tool they have is the essential part of the process of teaching and learning, then all the other kinds of relationships in the schools will have developed as well. But first we have to work with the teachers also and use these immigrant students to teach these teachers how to join a different kind of world with different kinds of interactions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fernanda. We have more questions here. This one comes from Bruno Albuquerque, and he's asking, what's the difference between translanguaging and code switching?
Oh, wow. Well, it depends on the author you're reading, actually, because some authors who used to say, oh, these are synonyms. But for me, and using some of the discussions that I've had with friends who work with this, and mainly with Ofelia, when we talk about code switching, as the word says, you are switching codes. So you're thinking about one specific language and another specific language. When you talk about translanguaging, that is a different thing. It means creating meaning using whatever you have, your experience, your feelings, your emotions, the languages you know, but this thing that is part of your repertoire, that is part of who you are. Antonietta Megali and I, we have created the concept of what we call Perejivania, and we've created a concept that says funds of perejivania, funds of living, or in Portuguese, patrimônio de vivências. What are your experiences? How did you understand the world, create the world? What were the sources you used, the resources you used to live different experiences? And how did these things become part of what you have in your background, in your possibilities of creating a new meaning? It's not only in terms of the languages you know or the linguistic resources, but everything you use to connect with the other. So it's very different from simply switching codes. And because of that, I see a big difference between code switching and translanguaging.
Yes, I agree. All right, and then the next question is, this one comes from Diego Satiro, and he's asking, do spatial literacies play a role for creating translanguaging spaces in school communities? And if so, what kind of role is this? Yeah.
Great question, Diego. Diego is one of our students at PUC, and he's a very smart guy, and I'm sure that this question comes from a lot of discussions. And one of the things, when you're talking about space, if you're talking about the language and the repertoire that the space itself has, we can think about how can we make meaning in different spaces using what the space and the different resources of the people we are interacting with in these different places in order to create meaning. So, of course, when we translang, we use whatever we have. So it's not only a question of us and what we have. If I'm here and I point to my marks here, or you look at the things you see here in my studio, in my place, you make meaning from this as well. So the way I dress, the way I present myself, create meaning. So in a way, if I understood what Diego is asking, everything that I have with me in that context and with the other, his history, his different possibilities of making ways of connecting to me, all of this is going to be part of the space or the current, as Ofelia mentioned, this way of being together in the flow of meaning making, which is not the flow of one language or another language, of one person, another person, one place or another place. But one of the things that I like very much, and we have discussed, is how do we use the repertoire of the places where we are? So if I'm at PUC, what are the repertoire of that space? If I am at Cultura Inglesa, what is the repertoire of Cultura Inglesa, and how does this influence the way I speak, the way we create meaning? If we are on Zoom, what are the resources that I have here in this space to create meaning, and how do I have to learn different ways of connecting to the others? So everything is interwoven. We cannot separate these things as if they were just language, feelings, space, and so on.
Yes, definitely.
I hope I have answered your question.
That was was very useful, Fernanda. And I think this is our last question. It comes from Nicole, and she's asking, in South Africa, we use a lot of translanguaging in our classroom environments. Ofelia and Fernanda, do you have any suggestions for further reading to increase our abilities?
Oh, well, if you go to Ofelia's page, you're going to see a lot of things. And I've been to South Africa, and with all the languages that circulate in the different places there, it's great that you can use translanguaging a lot, because you are exercising a political stance of respect towards the different communities. So I think that it's essential that you use translanguage. I do believe that here in Brazil, we have different Portugueses as well, and we have to learn how to deal with the different Portugueses that circulate in class. For example, when I present hip hop for you, the kind of Portuguese that is there is different from the Portuguese of the academic world, of a research article, for example. So how do we use all the languages that are there and create possibilities for people to connect? So if you want to read more, I suggest you go to Ofelia's page, because she has a lot of work there, and you will have a chance. By the way, go to ResearchGate, go to academia, put translanguaging there, and you will find tons of things that you can read about in Portuguese, in English, and in other languages. So that's my suggestion for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Fernanda, for joining us this morning, and thank you, Ofelia, for sharing your knowledge and your time with us. It was wonderful to have you here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dani. It's a pleasure to be here with you, with the teachers. Thank you for inviting me. I love to be with you.
Thank you, Fê.
Bye.
All right, I think it's the right time for us to have a lunch break. We'll be back at 1. We are not coming back to the main stage, but in the afternoon, you should be visiting the rooms according to the title of the session and the speakers. But try to enjoy your lunch visiting our sponsors, download the app to check the program if you have questions in terms of what session to attend this afternoon. But enjoy the afternoon sessions, and probably I'll see you later on in the afternoon in the main stage after the concurrent sessions. Enjoy your lunch. See you later.